Have you ever been told by a mentor or YouTube guru in a fancy looking studio to just use your ears? I certainly have, and I think it can be really bad advice. Or have you ever seen a meme about spending ages tweaking a compressor only to then notice it is in bypass? Have you ever been that meme? Could you have sworn you were hearing a difference? Human perception is not a measurement device. What we hear is determined by many outside factors, including what we see, what we know, and what we heard before. Many companies like plugin manufacturers or online mastering services know this all too well and try to exploit these biases to make their product seem much more desirable than it actually is. If we're not careful, they can lead us to making decisions that are based on what we think we hear, not what the sound actually is. So let's learn when we can and can't really trust our ears, and how we can use techniques like null tests, blind tests, loudness matching, and reference tracks to make better judgments of what we are hearing. Let me start this episode with a bold claim. It is categorically impossible for us humans to tell apart what we see and what we hear. Let me repeat, we are fundamentally unable to tell if we just heard something or if we saw it. Let me try to prove this to you. Let's talk about the McGurk effect. I'm going to play you 2 clips of someone saying a simple syllable. Just note what you hear.
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba.
I'm gonna guess in the first clip you heard her say ba. In the second clip the same person is saying fa. Well, wrong. Both clips had the exact same audio. Only the video was different for the second clip. But what you saw overrode what you heard. That's the McGurk effect. The interesting thing about this is that it works no matter if you know about it or not. Even researchers that have seen this clip thousands of times still experience the illusion. So let's try again.
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba.
Only if you close your eyes will it no longer affect you. So please close your eyes for this last demo.
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba.
Let's do another example. There's been this viral phenomenon on TikTok and YouTube Shorts of an ambiguous audio clip and multiple written out interpretations of what is being chanted. You will hear the audio as whichever piece of text you are currently focusing on.
That is embarrassing! 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 That is embarrassing!
Once again, what you saw determined what you heard. So now tell me, when you're comparing 2 EQ plugins, one with a slightly unfortunate digital interface and one made to look all analog and shiny, how can you tell which one sounds better? Could it be that they both sound exactly the same, but just looking at the analog UI makes your brain conjure up words like warm, transparent, and musical? Might this explain why people think that the visual of Pro Tools meters changes the sound? A cynic might even say plugin companies would never put this much effort into making your EQs look all vintage and aged if it wasn't going to bias your perception. And remember that you can fall for these effects even when you know they're happening to you. But your listeners won't ever see your plugins, all they care about is the sound. That's why some people insist on testing these plugins to see if they are really any different to your standard stock EQ. To perform a null test means to invert the polarity of one clip of audio and play it at the same time as another clip. If the sound disappears, they were exactly the same piece of audio. After all digital audio is just a stream of numbers. And if A minus B equals 0, we can confidently say that A equals B. So if you can get your fancy analog EQ plugin to perfectly null with your stock EQ, that's very suspicious. It's definitive proof that whatever difference you perceive between the two is not caused by the sound itself and therefore somewhat irrelevant to your listener. You may still prefer to look at one over the other while working and consider that reason enough to buy something, but their sound is gonna be exactly the same. A word of warning here is that we should try to be precise. Only when the sum of A and an inverted sound B is exactly 0, negative infinity dB loud, can we confidently say that they are perfectly identical. If the difference is tiny but not 0, we may still conclude that it is inaudible, but we need to be more careful here. Small differences can start mattering sometimes, for instance if they add up over many instances in your mix, or if you compress or distort the sound after the tested plugin. As you know, this will bring the loud and quiet parts of the sound closer together, meaning that what used to be so quiet it was inaudible may suddenly start to make a difference. Analyzers like Minimeters, EQ Curve Analyzer or Plugin Doctor can help us gain a lot of clarity when our ears are unreliable. They can help us visualize a frequency and phase response, find oversampling filters, excessive energy beyond our speaker range, or signs of aliasing. They can help us troubleshoot by narrowing down the origin of something we're hearing without being sure what's causing it. But they can just as well become a case of visuals leading us away from what we hear, making us see problem where we would hear none, and making poor value judgments based on how something looks instead of how it sounds. Here's an example. I saw a YouTube video by an accomplished producer recently in which he argued that you should always use linear phase EQs, because an EQ's phase shift can make a nice and neat saw wave look like this, even though it's outside of its frequency response. Which is a problem? Why? I could play with the two without showing you which is which and you wouldn't hear any difference. Now some people may say it peaks higher, but phase shift is just as likely to increase as it is to decrease the sound's peak value on anything but a rare few specifically designed and phase-aligned waveforms like the saw wave. I could just as easily create an example where the exact opposite happens. The EQ's phase shift bringing a weird looking sound to look all neat and nice. So in a real mix it could really go either way. Yet the oscilloscope in this specific example does look weird. We don't like how it looks. But who cares? Your listeners certainly won't. Be careful what you read into what you see and have a think if it really is a problem. Another good example of this are the spectrum analyzers on EQs. Nowadays almost every EQ has the same UI, a frequency response curve overlaid over a spectrum analyzer showing us before and after. This can easily misguide us into the mindset that an EQ's function is to fix imbalances as we see them on the spectrum analyzer. It isn't though. In music we use an EQ to improve what we hear. That may well mean making the spectrum of a sound look even weirder than before. There's no way of telling apart visually whether what you're seeing is an annoying resonance or just a flute that's vital to the arrangement. The two look exactly the same, more or less like sine waves. It's why I personally always have the spectrum analyzer turned off on my default EQ preset. Remember, what we can see overrides what we hear sometimes. If you think you see problems, you might start hearing them, whether they're real or not. If you need it for increased accuracy or solving a specific problem, you can always turn it on later. But first, leave it disabled and don't look, listen. Earlier I did something I feel a bit bad about. I showed you some examples from linguistics and then just claimed the same applies to audio plugins. I did this because the linguistics examples are much easier to demonstrate, but it's really not a very clean argument, so let's try to remedy this with some data about judgments of sound quality. It's not just what you see, other things like knowing how expensive something is that can significantly impact your judgment. Here's an interesting graph by a Harman acoustics researcher in which they compare the correlation of a headphone's sound quality rating and price in both blind tests and various magazines. You can see that in a lot of magazines the correlation between rating and price is significantly higher than in the blind tests performed by Harman. So simply knowing that something is expensive seems to have made reviewers think of it as disproportionately better sounding. Or here, a famous study done by the Audio Engineering Society on blind versus sighted listening tests on both expert and inexperienced listeners. You can see that in the sighted tests, the preference for certain speaker models are changed and also much exaggerated. Importantly, the ratings experienced listeners gave differed more between blind and sighted tests than those inexperienced listeners gave. Experience does not save you from bias, it seems to make you more biased, maybe because you've got more opinions formed already. And the overall preferences became much exaggerated and shifted towards different models, moving from blind to sighted tests on experienced listeners. Let me just quote from the paper's conclusion. In summary, listening tests where the audible differences between products were not difficult to hear, knowledge of product identity while listening had profound effects on listener opinions. In some instances, altered listener preferences resulted from listeners being less responsive to audible differences in the sighted tests than they were in the blind tests. For example, they were less responsive to differences caused by loudspeaker location in the room, and they were less responsive to differences associated with program material. Once again, Seeing and knowing overrides what you hear, and expertise will not make you immune to bias. This kind of unavoidable bias is why I try to perform blind tests myself whenever I can. You can probably do this in most DAWs, you just need a simple way to switch between multiple options without looking at your screen. In Bitwig I just place the plugins or settings I'm comparing in an FX selector, rename them and shuffle them around, and rename them again until I don't know which is which anymore. I then order the chains by which I like best and only look at the very end which is which. This is how I choose things like clippers, limiters, reverb plugins, or the different phase responses in EQ plugins like Pro Q. Sometimes during a session, like when choosing a mastering limiter, sometimes in dedicated sessions. I'm not really trying to be perfectly rigorous here, of course. I'm simply trying to give myself an opportunity to listen with significantly less bias. This helps me make more rational choices based on actual sound differences. I think I've made my point on blind tests. Let's move on to another important bias in our hearing. A bias for change. You know how you can always see your nose, but because it's there all the time, your brain kind of makes you not see it? We get used to mixes as we listen to them, and our brain internally cues them, compensates for certain resonances or imbalances. This is called habituation, and it's what makes life with something like tinnitus a little more bearable. It also helps you get used to less than ideal speakers, by just knowing them really well. It's a really helpful effect, but it can make us overlook problems we want to notice and fix too. Sudden changes are generally much easier to hear than gradual changes. Think of the frog in boiling water. One way to deal with this is to A/B switch between different settings or mixes, to turn the slow and gradual tweaking of presets into a sudden change. This will help make subtle differences much more audible. Here's a simple demo with EQ. One softly fading between two settings, as you often do as you tweak your processing, one's directly jumping between the two. So after you set an EQ band the next time, turn it on and off. Turn it into a sudden difference. Decide if you actually prefer it with or without the effect. This will train your ears and help you discern much more easily whether the change you just made is desirable or not. Because we can so easily lose orientation when it comes to frequency balance, it can be very helpful to have a reference for us to compare to, and to use as a way to recalibrate our ears. The way I personally use reference tracks is less as a mix to imitate and more as a reference point I know well on many systems, to allow me to compare my mix to, after I've gotten too used to it. This is also why I usually use multiple quite different songs, to create a broader frame of reference to orient myself in. Pink noise mixing uses a similar rationale, using the 3 dB per octave slope of pink noise as an objective point of reference to balance your mix against. Either will help you create a consistent context in which you mix to counter your ear's fluctuating sense of frequency balance. Ear fatigue may at first seem similar to habituation, but I think it's worth thinking of them as two separate phenomena. Hearing fatigue is a wearing out of your ears after prolonged exposure to loud sounds. Your ears become less sensitive, in extreme cases permanently. We all lose our hearing over the course of our lives. Exposure to loud sounds or moderate sounds for long accelerate this process. Reference track won't save you here. There is only one thing that will work: silence. Limit your exposure to high volume by not mixing loud for too long. Wear hearing protection when going to concerts. Take lots of breaks in which you don't listen to any sound, especially when working on mixing or mastering. The closer I get to mastering, the shorter I try to make my production sessions. Breaks won't only protect your hearing, they'll help you come back with a fresh perspective better than any reference track could. There is one last bias we need to talk about: excitement bias. Which of these two mixes sounds better to you? A or B? Wild guess, you said B. What's the difference? What's the magic sauce? Well, B is louder. Not by much, but B is 2 dB louder than A. That's it. I just made sure you can't see it on the scope. We all know that louder music just sounds better. Maybe because our ears have a more neutral frequency response at higher volumes. Maybe louder sounds just sound closer. I don't know. Engineers put a lot of effort into making their mixes louder within the constraint of a wave file, to exploit their own and the audience's excitement bias for louder mixes. But at the same time, how can we avoid falling for it ourselves? If there is a difference in loudness between two sounds, it can become very hard to hear other differences between them, and we will almost always prefer the louder sound. AI mastering sites know this all too well. They'll often play you back the mastered version of your song louder than the unmastered version, which will make it sound much better by default. It makes you completely unable to objectively judge the differences between the two versions, because you're distracted by the increasing gain. A lot of artifacts become impossible to notice. Some plugins that advertise themselves with their box tone do this too. They'll simply add a half dB of gain to make it seem like the plugin magically makes the sound better, but it's not some analog magic sauce. You don't need a fancy plugin for that, you just need a fader. Watch out for A/B demos that aren't loudness matched, especially when the person setting up the demo has a reason to make you want to prefer one or the other version. Yes, making a song loud is part of mastering, but to judge if they achieve this cleanly or with lots of distortion, what you need is a loudness matched comparison. If the site doesn't offer one, or at least let you change the volumes of the tracks yourself, run. It's not how loud you make it, it's how you make it loud that makes a good master. This is why when creating A/B tests for yourself, you want to match their loudness. I like to think of two different methods for doing this: peak matching and perceptual matching. Peak matching is basically normalizing the sounds so they both peak at the same level. The main purpose of this would simply be to make sure that both sounds clip at the same point, while making a conscious choice to still allow yourself to be biased towards differences in loudness caused by the density or frequency response, which you may consider part of the sound. Bitwig's Auto Match uses peak matching as far as I can tell. But as we learned in episode 1 of this series, our perception of loudness has little to do with the sound's peak level. So to tune our ears to the differences in sound quality, we want to match two sounds' perceptual loudness instead. An automated way to do this was to match the two sounds' short-term LUFS values. As you know, LUFS aren't perfect, but they do have the advantage of being objective, because the other alternative is matching the sounds by ear, which can be a better estimate of perception, but also opens you up to all sorts of human error. A simple technique that can help you a lot when setting limiters or clippers is just linking input and output gain. This way you will be less distracted by the difference in loudness the effect causes and more focused on how it changes your sound quality. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than unlinked gain in my experience. After setting your limiter with linked gain, simply unlink the gain to bring the output up to peak at 0 or -1 dB. I hope it's become obvious by now that using your ears is very much not a bad thing and always the goal. You just need to understand your perception and the situations in which it can mislead you. Just use your ears, given as advice, can sometimes simply disregard all these biases and nuances, discourage closer analysis, sometimes naively, sometimes with deceptive intent. So let us summarize. What can we do to be able to just use our ears? First of all, close our eyes and let go of our knowledge. Make sure none of our preconceived notions can cloud our judgment in our blind test. Make sure you don't know which is which when comparing two sounds. And don't tell your friends either when you ask them for feedback. And don't think because you're a trained engineer you are above these biases. If anything, you should be extra careful whenever you know a lot about a subject. Secondly, try to go for sudden changes and listen with well-rested ears, calibrated by listening to music you know well. Lastly, match the loudness of whatever you're comparing, or the difference in volume will bulldoze any nuances of sound quality. That was it, the last episode of my series on psychoacoustics, my attempt at helping you better understand your perception of sound and the role it plays in your music production. There will always be more to cover, of course, more nuances I missed out on. One last time I'll remind you of my disclaimer that I am not a scientist. I'm just some self-taught internet weirdo that likes making funny sounds on his computer. Whatever interesting things I find while doing so I mold into my YouTube videos. What you make of them is ultimately up to you. If you like my style of teaching and want to learn more and support more videos and series like this, all around sound creation and manipulation, consider becoming a channel member for regular bonus lessons. I also create courses on music production. You can find links on my card site, where you will also find a form to book a private lesson with me. All these things ultimately help me financially justify making videos like this. So yeah, hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Cheers!